Welcome to the second global webinar for the NYU D Prize Global Social Venture Competition. So today's webinar will basically introduce a very simple tool that I think can be useful for any social or commercial venture. So in terms of what we'll be doing today, I'd like to introduce you a little bit to how I found out about this tool and why I wish I was aware of it back in 2000. And then I'll put it into context in terms of how you design a venture for achieving both feasibility and impact. And then finally, we'll work through the different questions that are included within the Idea Napkin. And I'll give you an example of how you might fill it out for a venture related to this competition. So hopefully you've had the opportunity to print this out. If you haven't, then all you need is a sheet of paper and you can jot down any ideas that might occur to you. And then in terms of our live audience, I think you have copies of this. If you don't, then you can just get it from the front. So back in 2000, I was living in New York and I was working with some people in Pakistan to set up the first venture capital fund in the country. It had not been done before. There had been a number of companies in the IT sector that had basically started off on an offshoring model. And this was when kind of the internet bubble had come and then had burst, and there was kind of a little bit of a realignment going on in the US. And I was in school at Columbia Law School in New York. I had, prior to that, worked on Wall Street. And I was thinking about how to take what was happening in Silicon Valley and bring it to Pakistan. So that was about 17 years ago. And what I wish I knew at that time was a simple tool that we could give to people who are starting off as entrepreneurs to really help them refine their thinking so that they can take their kind of brilliant ideas and make them better and better and do that in a very quick way. Because what we noticed is that typically people would come to us with, I mean, even people that we invested, you know, whose ideas we ultimately invested in, we spent like maybe 6 months to a year helping them to refine their ideas to get to something that was both very impactful and very feasible. And so now we're implementing some of those same things at the Aman Center for Entrepreneurial Development here at IBA. We've basically experimented with different methods that work, that don't work in you know, our own context. And I think this is a tool that can work pretty much anywhere. So according to some research that was done about 20 years ago by Stevens and Burley, they looked at industrial innovation. And what they found was that for every one success, there were about 3,000 raw ideas that engineers or designers had come up with. And basically what would happen is that from those 3,000 ideas, there would be kind of documentation of about 300. And then there would be kind of plans of various levels of detail, and then about 1.7 would get actually implemented, and then the failure rate was almost 50%, so you would end up with one success. So if you need to have 3,000 raw ideas to get down to one success, now if you can kind of streamline that process a little bit and improve the odds in your favor, and do that quickly, you can actually have a recipe for being more productive. So if you look at planning and refining ideas, so the number one mistake that most new entrepreneurs make is that they spend too little time thinking about their ideas, right? So what happens is that they get a brainwave and they're like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. They don't spend enough time seeking feedback from other people, doing research, looking at what else is out there in the market, coming up with an idea of how much it's going to cost them and all of that. And so they rush out with something without having thought very much about it. And then they encounter problems that they need to solve that probably if they thought about it, they could have anticipated a lot of the problems that would be occurring. So if this is the number one problem that most commonly new entrepreneurs make, what do you think is the number two problem? Okay. We've got a suggestion from the live audience here at IBA. If anybody wants to take a crack at it from online, I'll give a moment for them to do that. And you can guess too. And people over here have guessed? Okay, so let me see which what we've got here. So we've got budget. Yes, that is a problem that entrepreneurs face often, and sometimes they underestimate how much they should be budgeting. Actually, the budget comes later on. Most of the big mistakes that new entrepreneurs make, they probably don't reach the stage where they can actually make a budget because they failed much earlier. And so the number one problem, like we said, was spending too little time, and the number two problem is spending too much time. And one of the people here at the IBA audience guessed that. So now you're stuck because you want to spend enough time, but you don't want to spend too much time thinking about what you're going to do and not actually doing it and not getting out into the field and learning. So what you need is a method where you can very quickly come up with different iterations of your idea and refine them to the point where you feel that they have the right mix of two things. And what those two things are reflected on this matrix. So on the axis at the bottom, what you've got is low to high feasibility, right? And then on the vertical axis, you've got low to high impact. And I've just kind of separated that out into 4 boxes. So where you definitely do not want to be with your idea is an idea that appears to have low feasibility and low potential impact, right? And any guesses on where you'd like to be? High feasibility and high impact, that's ideal, right? Now, sometimes what you'll do is you'll kind of trade off feasibility and impact, but if you've got something that's not very likely to happen, and if it happens, then the results are not going to be of any great consequence, then probably it's not something that's worth doing, right? If something is very likely to happen, it's very feasible, but you've designed it in a way that if it succeeds, then not that many people are going to benefit, or the way that they benefit is not going to be that meaningful, then again, you'll wonder, is this something that's worth doing? So now if you decide that, no, I wanted to have more impact, you might come up with now some like really wild idea that has low feasibility, right? And so if you could have a way of quickly working through successive iterations and versions of a simple idea to get it to the point where, at least on paper, it looks like it's got high feasibility and high impact, then you're starting off in the right place. So this is where the Idea Napkin comes in. And where I learned about the Idea Napkin was from a Canadian entrepreneur who also teaches at a business school there. So this was at a conference a few years ago in Fort Worth, Texas. And it's one of the best sessions that I've ever attended in terms of practical tips for entrepreneurs. And the thing that made it the best was that it was very simple. And so we each got a sheet of paper, and it was our Idea Napkin, and it had 5 questions on it. And so the first question is, who are you? And this is not a trick question. It's a simple description that you might give when you were introducing yourself to someone, right? So if you're a student, then you can write that you're a student. If you've got a particular major, you can write that. Which university you're at would be relevant. If there are any people participating who are kind of out in the workplace already, you could mention what kind of job you've got, where you are, things like that. Okay, so it's a very, very simple, basic question. And so here I've got 3 BBA students in their 3rd year at IBA Karachi. So when we ran the competition last year, there was a group of 3 BBA students. We didn't have this tool for them at that point, but I've worked with them on their idea. They actually won the competition from the IBA side for a venture that I'm going to describe to you. So their names are Anzar, Khadija, and Hadi, and their idea, their current name for it is Soch, right? So in this competition, one of the ways that we help you to come up with something that is more likely to be feasible, right, in terms of actually working on the ground and having high impact, is to actually have filtered through a number of possible poverty solutions, right? And there are tens of thousands that may have been tried by people, right? And identify which ones seem to have high feasibility and high impact. Now, obviously, that's kind of in a generic setting or where it's worked before, and we'll be looking at your particular version or implementation of that in a particular place for a particular audience. So the challenge that they chose to address was the flipped classroom challenge, which means that rather than the teacher explaining the material during class and then giving homework, what happens is that the students use kind of online content to get an overview of the material, and then in class they can actually do exercises. Now, they have to think about how this might work in schools in Pakistan. And so anyway, so in terms of the challenge that they picked, though, that pretty much determined the answer to the second question, what are you offering? So they decided that they were going to offer low-cost tablets and training for flipped classrooms, right? Now, for people from IBA who will be participating in this competition this year, so we decided not to make that flipped classroom challenge an option for you for this year, because we'd like to choose a winner who will be working on another challenge. So the 3 areas that you can choose from are governance, healthcare, and the third area is solar lamps. Okay. We had a custom option from last year, and what we found was that the rigor and research that had gone into those ideas was not as strong, and so we've not given that as an option for you this year, but I think that in the other universities that's still an option, right? So anyway, so you would have to do this with pretty much any idea that you're working on. Okay, so the third question is, who are you offering it to? So the first 2 questions are pretty much already set. So the first one, you can't really change who you are at this point, right? Similarly, if you're choosing from the proven poverty solutions that have been provided by DPRIZE, then really where you start thinking about what you're going to do when you pick one of these solutions is who you're going to offer it to. And the who could involve where they are, right? And in the case of this flipped classroom option, the students, initially they came up with an idea and they shared it with me. And what they said was that they were going to work on rural schools. And they were going to work initially on a school that was a few hours outside of Karachi to run their pilot. And we discussed it. And what they realized was that there are plenty of schools that are catering to low-income students in Karachi. But logistically, it would make it a lot simpler for them if they were operating from here. And so they decided that at least initially, they'll focus on Karachi. And there are a lot of schools that they can work with. And that eventually, if their pilot project is successful, they will roll out possibly to other cities or rural areas in Pakistan, and then maybe even go abroad if they want to, right? Similarly, because this was an education, they could have had different grade levels. So what they decided to do was to have any grade level, right, for basically primary and middle school students. So they, for various reasons, they felt that high school students were not the people that they wanted to work with. And then they chose one particular subject, which was English, which was based on the fact that that's an area where a shortage of skilled teachers is a really serious issue in Pakistan, especially for schools that are teaching, that are, you know, either government schools or non-profit organizations operating schools, catering to a lower income target audience, that they don't have the kind of budget that is available to hire somebody whose English is really that good. So far, you know, nothing is really that complicated, right? And if you've been going along jotting kind of some answers to these questions, then, you know, you might, when we open it up for question and answers in about 15 minutes, you can ask about specific questions that you weren't sure what to write or something, and I'll check on here and try to address those questions. So now the fourth question, and now we're kind of zeroing in on kind of the different factors that will lead to feasibility, right? So in order to implement any new solution, you have to have a target audience. You have to have something that you want them to do. And the real question in terms of feasibility, the starting point, is that, okay, if there's a need and there's certain key people that need to kind of get on board with your solution, what is it that's going to motivate them to accept your solution and to implement it, right? And to support it rather than to resist it. And when they looked at, when Anzar and Khadija and Hadi for Soch looked at the kinds of schools that they would be working with, what they found was that the government schools or the NGO schools had teachers that, some of them were very kind of believed in what they were doing, but for the most part, they were not paid very much money, and a lot was expected of them, right? So they thought that, okay, well, what we could do is that we can kind of look at the trade-off between the learning outcome and the amount of effort that's put in, and offer an opportunity to create a better learning experience, a better learning outcome with the same level of effort, right? And they felt that this would be something that would be appealing to the teachers that they were targeting, right? Finally, and this kind of brings the questions to a full circle, is what are the relevant core competencies that the people on the team have that are now relevant to this particular offering, this particular target audience, and the key success factor that will make it be accepted. And so because they were students and they didn't have a lot of work experience, but some of them had worked in a nonprofit school, what they felt was that the key things from their background was, one of them was a marketing major, two of them were finance majors, and they felt that there's stuff here in our marketing and finance coursework and projects that we've done that's relevant to what's required for this kind of project. And then when they looked at what was kind of around them in their educational environment, what they realized was that maybe they didn't have a lot of capital, maybe they didn't have a lot of domain expertise, and they were all from major cities. So none of them are from a rural background. But what they realized was that in the university community where they're based, there are students from all over the country, right, who have some time that they can volunteer. They have, some of them have studied in government schools, some of them have studied in NGO schools, and some of them have studied in schools with a higher budget that had a better program for teaching English, right? Then they had, within their community at the school, they also had professors that taught different subjects, including English, who had domain expertise and that could help them identify and implement good teaching materials. And then finally, there was a large alumni community that could potentially be donors or that were working either in the education department or at other levels of government that could become champions and supporters of their work. Okay, so this whole exercise, depending on how much thought you put into it, could be done within a matter of minutes, or you might spend a half an hour, even an hour thinking deeply about it. But what you could possibly do even is that you could, if you're not sure which challenge you want to go after, right? So at IBA, we're offering you 3, and you might have more options at the university or school where you're studying. So what you can do is you can actually fill out multiple versions of this, right? Once you filled it out, now what do, right? And this is where kind of the value creation kind of really gears up. So when you have something in your mind, you make certain assumptions, whether they're explicit or implicit, right? And the impact and the feasibility will depend on those assumptions. And what happens when somebody is critiquing your idea is they focus in on those assumptions, and especially the weaker assumptions, and they can help pinpoint them for you, and you can go back to the drawing board and come up with a better version. So the way that this is supposed to work is that you fill out the idea napkin and answer these 5 questions, and then you actually take what you've got and you share it with 5 or more people, and you pick people who either have, you can pick some of your professors. If you're in a university setting, you can pick successful entrepreneurs. You can pick people who maybe worked at a school or a hospital or whatever has relevant kind of domain knowledge, right? And you get feedback from 5 or more people on your initial hunch or idea, right? Based on these 5 questions. And then what you do is that you take that feedback, and what you can actually do is you can ask them to rate the feasibility on a scale of 1 to 10, and you can ask them to rate the impact on a scale of 1 to 10. And what you do is you plot it out. And so if you look at this diagram, you've got the first. Here, let me just see if I can. Okay, so you've got the first iteration here. And so what you see is that in the first iteration, you had an idea that had low feasibility, but you were thinking big, right? And you came up with something that potentially had very high impact. But the problem that was identified based on the feedback that you got was that feasibility didn't seem to be very good. And whatever they came up with would probably come out of one of these 5 questions, right? And they would say, okay, well, we have concerns about feasibility because of the answer to this question, right? So what you do then is that you come up with the next round, right? And the beauty of this is because you know you have a process that will help you to improve your idea, you don't have to worry in the beginning and damp your kind of enthusiasm and your kind of creative process by thinking too hard about, oh, does this have feasibility? Does this have impact? You just go with what you've got, right? And you let the people who are giving you your feedback tell you where you are. So now you realize that, okay, I need to address these points in terms of the feasibility of what I'm suggesting, what I'm trying to do, right? And so what you do then is that you come up with your next iteration. And so you might, for example, either choose a different challenge, right, if it looks very negative, or you might actually come up with a more targeted impact, or come up with a slightly different value proposition, add in something that you'd missed out, right? So for example, in the case of the flipped classroom model, it's possible that when they were starting out, they were thinking of doing it for many different subjects. And what they realized was that to actually have content for all those subjects might be too difficult, right? So anyway, so you look at the individual questions and you come up with the next iteration. And so maybe the next time you kind of err on the side of high feasibility, right? But now the impact seems to have kind of gotten constrained a little bit. And so what happens is that each time you go through the process, you're kind of getting hopefully closer to this zone up here where you have a high feasibility, high impact idea, right? Now, the way that this can actually help you in terms of the NYU D Prize social venture competition is, excuse me, is that once you've kind of gone through this process, right, and you give your submission in the beginning of February for your first draft, basically your concept note, right? Really, your concept note, you're going to be answering these 5 questions in your concept note anyway, and you'll mention a few other things that are specifically asked for. But first of all, you'll have all of the details that you need to write your concept note, and you will have already gone through a process of getting feedback from people to improve your idea. And so the chances of your succeeding and getting to the next round will be higher. And also what will happen is that as you get feedback and you learn what areas you need to get more knowledge about, you'll go and talk to people in those areas. You'll do research about that, and you'll be able to improve your ideas in that manner as well. So in terms of what you do from here, what I suggest is that first of all, you should just begin, right? Because what happens is that you can spend a lot of time thinking, and thinking. The problem with thinking is that you can actually keep thinking the same thing, or you can stop thinking. The moment you take an action and begin, right, and you take something out of your head and put it into either onto a sheet of paper, or you talk to somebody about it, or you go and you look at the competition website and start thinking through, okay, which challenge should I be working on? What happens is that your thinking starts to change. So this is a quote from the famous, I guess, for our purposes here, let's call him a philosopher, all right? So whatever you can do or dream you can do, begin it. Boldness has genius, power, and magic in it. Begin it now, right? So when you leave this, and hopefully you've already begun by jotting something down on a piece of paper, but the idea is that once you've begun, you can take a number of small steps, right? And then something will come by and you'll be able to take a bigger step, and you'll basically be able to move closer and closer to your target destination. So I'm going to end here and open the floor to questions. So we've got the live audience here at IBA, and we've got some people who are following along online. So if you want to just, so we'll give the people who are online a moment to ask their questions. And then if you've got a question here in the live audience, then you can just jot it down and I'll come to you as well. Okay, so we've got our first question. Okay, and it's showing up on the, okay, may I ask that if I take the education challenge to South Africa and I've never been there, how can I run the survey to reach my target living in there? Okay, so the way that you would apply this for a project in South Africa is that, so on your first question, you would probably write that you're not in South Africa, right? Or you would write something about you that indicates that I'm assuming that the person who's asking the question is concerned because they're not in South Africa, but they want to run the project in South Africa, right? And so you've identified what you're offering, right? And then the who you're offering it to, you've mentioned that you're going to offer this flipped classroom, or there's another education challenge option for girls' education that D-Prize has documented. So suppose that you've picked one of those and you want to implement it in South Africa, right? Now, if you share this with somebody, even if they're not in South Africa, one of the things that they'll identify when they look at this is they'll say, well, you're sitting in New York or Karachi or Beijing or Singapore or Dhaka, and this project is in South Africa. Have you really done enough research, or do you have a partner in South Africa that can help you implement on the ground? Otherwise, you're not going to get points for feasibility. So what you do then at that stage is that you will go back. So even if you actually didn't identify this as an issue up front, you will when you get feedback from people wherever you are, right? And you'll realize that, oh, okay, well, maybe I need to reach out to people who are in South Africa to, first of all, get feedback on what I've proposed, and secondly, to actually see if there are people who can direct me towards resources that will help me to improve my idea. And the great thing is that with the internet, you don't have to be in South Africa to find people in South Africa that can help you on your project, right? And since this pilot project for this competition, the way that it runs is that it's done in the summer. So even though you'll be going in the summer, if you win, you can actually identify people that you could collaborate with and work with and get information from and benefit from beforehand. I hope that answers the question. Okay, let's see if we've got any more questions coming up. Or if anybody in the live audience has a question, then we can take that question too. Okay, so there's a question about, oh, right here. Let's just see what's here. What are some of the ways you can determine how feasible your idea is? Okay, so this is where we come to the second most common mistake that new entrepreneurs make, right? Which is thinking too much, right? So here what we've done, and the way that this competition is set up is that actually you will find out exactly how feasible your idea is. You will find it out when you run your pilot, right? Because it won't just be an idea, it'll be something that you're implementing. The idea at this stage is to screen out for obvious kind of errors that you might have made in your thinking. And if the people that you've solicited feedback from actually have some relevant domain expertise, then what you can do is get feedback from them on how to improve the feasibility of your idea. Now, there is no exact, precise quantification method for knowing how feasible your idea is. But people who are used to listening to ideas, right? If you ask them, then they would say, oh, okay, this is the reason that I don't think this is a feasible idea. But often what they'll do is that they'll kind of form an immediate impression about, and if you ask them to put it on a scale of 1 to 10, which is what you'll ask them to do, they will basically use their intuition. And then when you say, oh, okay, well, why is my idea only a 3 in terms of feasibility? Then they'll think about it a little bit and they'll say, oh, it's because of your answer to question number 2, or because of your answer to question number 5, that we don't think that your competency set is a good fit with what exactly you're trying to do, and maybe you need to bring other people in, or whatever. Okay, I hope that answers the question. And if it doesn't, then you can ask a follow-up question as well. Okay, so there was a question earlier from the IBA audience, and that question was about the who are you and what are your core competencies, right? And the question is, like, what if I don't have any prior experience working in the social sector? And this is something that I've just gotten interested in because I saw this email about this competition, right? So in response to that question, the fact that you're here, the fact that you took this step is actually something about who you are, because what that means is that you have concern about different social issues, and you'd like to actually spend time and kind of make an effort to address that, right? So that's an asset, right? So you don't have to necessarily think about what have I done in this particular domain. Think about what your personal attributes are that make you good at something, okay? And there's a very interesting book that I read when I was setting up my third startup, and I wish I had read it when I was doing the first startup, because I would focus in on things that I was weak at, and I would think about how do I improve myself in those areas. And this book is called Discover Your Strengths, right? And the idea was that people are really successful at doing something that has high, huge, tremendous impact. They overcome their weaknesses, but the reason that they're successful at what they're succeeding at is because of a strength that they had long before they set out to do what they're doing, right? And so they came up with a model, and they chose a problem that leveraged their strengths. So it's much more important for you to understand what your kind of innate strengths are. And you can ask people again and say, okay, what do you think I'm really good at, right? And what you do when you're putting together a team is you find other people whose strengths complement your strengths. So you might all be students at a particular university, but your classmates are probably good at things that you might be weak at, and you're probably good or exceptional at things that they might not be as good at. Okay? So we've got a couple more minutes, so we can, I think, take 1 or 2 more questions. Shamim, are there any questions from your side? Can you still hear me, Shamim? Okay, I think your mic is off. Okay, so it seems that we've got kind of all of the questions that were going to be put forward to us. Thank you very much for joining. If you have any kind of follow-up questions, you can email me at, here, let me just put that back on. Okay, so my email address, which I put earlier, is mali@iba.edu.pk. So if you have any questions about how you can implement this solution to implement the Idea Napkin, or if you'd actually like to share your Idea Napkin and get some feedback, whether you're a student at IBA or at one of the other universities and want to get some feedback, I would be more than happy to give that to you. Okay, thank you very much.
program.